Okay, fine. Thank you. Welcome to today's Budget and Performance Committee meeting. We will be discussing the 2022-23 GLA Group budget. Please make sure that your electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any interruptions. Can I now ask our clerk, Paul Goodchild, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies for absence from Assembly members Duval, Dr Sahota and Rogers, and Assembly members Moema, Desai and Prince are attending today as substitutes. Bailey.
Bailey.
Apologies.
No worries. It's definitely Assembly Member Bailey. Right. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare? No, thank you. Can we confirm the minutes of the meetings held on the 5th of January 2022 and the 14th of January 2022 to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you. Can we note the ongoing and closed actions arising from previous meetings of the committee? Thank you. Can we note the recent action taken by myself as chairman under delegated authority following consultation with party group lead members, namely to agree the committee's report, which is the response to the Mayor's draft consultation budget 2022 and 23, and note the response received from the Mayor of London attached at Appendix 2. Thank you. So we now move on to our main item of business, the 2022-23 GLA Group budget. And I would like to welcome our guest, David Gallie, Executive Director of Resources at the GLA, David Bellamy, the Mayor's Chief of Staff at the GLA, Enver, Assistant Director, Group Finance and Performance, and Luke Webster, Assistant Director, Group Treasury and Chief Investment Officer. Good morning, all of you. Thank you for attending. So I'll start, as is normal, with the questions. So I'll start to David Gallie, if I may. With the GLA Group's final spending plans at 556 million more than the version of the budget that was consulted on, do you feel everything was done to ensure transparency around the income uplifts when they were known?
Yes, I do. Clearly the sum involved, is material, but I think it's important that we just put that in context. So, although that sum, is over £500 million, the overall GLA Group budget, as you recall, Chairman, is 19 billion. So that's about just under 3% of variance. And the issues, as we've rehearsed at length, I think, in committee and also at the budget plenary, the GLA is hugely dependent on two things which are outside of our control on those numbers. The first being the government's decisions around the resource allocation, and obviously I can take you through, or Enver can take you through some more of the detail, the makeup of all the individual items that led to that large sum. And, to be frank, we are still awaiting a number of government decisions that are vital in terms of pinning down the exact level of resource that we have available. And the second element, and has been in growing importance, has been the billing authorities' returns. We are, again, absolutely dependent upon their returns on council tax and business rates. And as you know, we don't receive those in practice until, in reality, that's kind of first week in February. And even then, there's all sorts of changes that are still there, given the complexity of those returns and the difficulties that the boroughs have in making those returns, but also in the advice and guidance the government has supplied, which often has caused difficulties. So, as always, I take it as my own personal responsibility to give you, the Assembly, your committee, as much information as I can, when I can. The thing I guess I would emphasise is that because we don't actually get the final numbers until, as I say, that early part of February, and obviously there's then a need to discuss with the Mayor and the Chief of Staff the political decisions they want to make around the allocation of those sums. And then we have a very tight deadline to then issue the final budget report. I mean, me and my team and Enver in particular, we do everything that we possibly can to issue that information as quickly as we can, but we are facing those huge constraints. I'm obviously happy, and Enver's happy to add more to that, but hopefully that's an introductory answer to that important question.
Well, I think we've been told that before, but equally every single year we end up with a massive amount of money coming back after we've scrutinised the budgets, which is very unsatisfactory for us as a committee looking at where the money is being spent. Can you briefly summarise the process of how you came to make the determination you did regarding the money that became available from the Billing Authority Repayment Reserve, which from now on I will be calling the BARR Reserve?
Sorry, I'm not quite sure I follow the question. Can you repeat that, Chairman?
Can you summarise the process of how you came to make the determination you did regarding the money, what you've done with the money?
I mean, I'm not sure that's probably more a question for the Chief of Staff in terms of the allocations of resources. I mean, when I take a view on reserves, it is to balance the risks that we are facing, the uncertainties we are facing. And I think one of the things that, again, I'd emphasise that we are now facing is because we have taken a prudent view of the level of reserves necessary, that also allows us to cope with the impending cost of living crisis and allows the Mayor and the Chief of Staff some scope for decisions around how they will cope with that increasing inflationary pressure that will hit both pay and non-pay. I mean, ultimately, what I'm doing on the business rates reserve is ensuring that we have cover for a black swan event. And obviously, we've gone through a series of kind of black swan events over the last couple of years, which I think has kind of vindicated that approach. But we also need to refresh that level of assessment of the business rates reserve once I think we have a greater level of stability on the return to normalcy from the pandemic, if the pandemic is now beginning to become normalised.
So what point in the budget cycle were decisions made on what the bulk of that BARR funding would be used for?
Well, we have a core assessment of that worst case scenario so that the business rates reserve will always cover that eventuality. But clearly there are decisions to be made from a political point of view by the Chief of Staff around those level of reserves. I mean, reserves are, I mean, I'm a great believer in holding reserves as I've set out, but also it's public money, and that public money should be deployed to best effect. And therefore, there's a trade-off between ensuring that reserves are there, but also reserves are used for the benefit of Londoners. And that's a trade-off that needs to be guided by my professional judgment of what is needed, but it also needs to reflect the priorities of the Mayor.
Chair, I think it's possible that the two of you are at slight cross purposes and talking about slightly different things. You were asking about the billing authority return reserve. So on that specifically, the committee will remember that we were faced with a situation when we set the budget for 21-22 whereby it was clear that there were going to be large numbers of appeals from business rate payers who hadn't been using, for instance, their offices, and thus were going to claim there was a material change of circumstances and that their business rate bills should be retrospectively lowered. The consequences of that were that, if that happened as we expected it would, that we would be at a safety net position within the business rate system, and the money that the billing authorities had said they were going to give us, and indeed they were then bound to give us, we would have to pay back to them at the conclusion of that process. And that's why that money was put into a separate reserve to repay billing authorities, along with some other changes related to 2020-21. After we set the budget for 21-22, the government announced that it was going to take legislative action to prevent such material change of circumstance appeals. That legislation ultimately cleared Parliament and received royal assent on 15th December, so just as we were in the process of finalising the consultation budget. So we weren't able to take it into that legislation's passing into consideration and get the consultation budget out in time. But we came back to it for the draft budget, and the advice that the Mayor and I received from David was that, while we couldn't totally rule out the risk of legal challenge to that legislation, which after all was taking retrospective action, it now would be prudent to spend that money that had been put aside. Obviously, it's one-off funds, but that it would be available for expenditure, and we would no longer need to pay it back into the reserve. Back to the billing authorities, and that's why then the Mayor was able to take in the draft budget and the final draft budget expenditure decisions based upon that.
Okay, so that was on the 15th of December.
So the royal assent of the legislation was on 15th of December.
Thank you, that's much clearer. Thank you, Mr Bellamy. I'm going now to Assembly Member Bailey.
Good morning, gentlemen. Can I start with David, please, and to talk about the transport reserve. How established are the plans for the transport services reserve?
Good morning. They are, so one part of it is very clearly established, which is that £61.5 million that is coming from the council tax precept in 22-23 will be paid across to TfL in 23-24, and that forms part of their expenditure planning for that year. In terms of the rest of the money, there isn't a detailed plan at the moment. We face a great deal of uncertainty. Maybe to give you the context about that so that you can see some of the challenges that the Mayor faces. If you think back to before the pandemic, TfL had cash balances of above £2 billion. So that's in excess of the £1.2 billion, which is the minimum cash that TfL needs to hold as a trading business with regular liabilities to meet. And obviously, in the early months of the pandemic, as everybody stayed home and we ended up with passenger numbers at something like 5% of their normal levels, it was those cash balances that kept the network running until the government stepped in with extraordinary funding. So what TfL is doing in its budget, which its board set on Wednesday, is trying to get to its cash balances up to £1.4 billion by the end of 22-23. Of course, given the extraordinary funding that's required, as we still have lower than previous passenger numbers, that is dependent on government decisions and government support through the rest of the year. But if that happens, what you can see is that there's over £600 million of contingency that TfL had to meet financial risk that is no longer there, that has been lost because of the costs of the pandemic. And I think we would all agree that TfL faces very significant risks at the moment. Risks to, from 23-24, the government's saying, well, right, we're ending the support we've provided and you've got to stand on your own 2 feet. And so that means significant risks in terms of fares income. What if, for example, let's hope not, but there's a new variant of COVID. We saw what happened with Omicron in recent months. Energy costs. TfL is one of the biggest users of energy in the country for obvious reasons, and obviously we're well aware of what's going on there, and general inflationary pressure. So in that context, £321 million, which is what's left in that reserve after the council tax allocation, compared to the £600 million we effectively had of contingency pre-pandemic, it's actually not a huge sum. And so you hopefully can see from that Assembly member, some of the uncertainties we've got, and ensuring clearly that TfL can, from 23-24 onwards, set a balanced budget is absolutely the first order of business.
Is there what work's being done to remove some of that uncertainty, or is that just going to be a perennial thing that you'll have to deal with, or is there points along the timeline where things will become more certain?
I mean, I guess things do become just more certain as we move on, but then you probably will start, it's inherent, isn't it? You'll see more uncertainty further in the future. So, you know, for instance, you know, as we operate through this financial year with government support, undoubtedly as a condition of that support, the government will have expectations around what happens to fares income. So will those for 23-24 be set out in a funding deal that replaces the current one that expires on 24th June? Or will that be later? Will there be then, as happened this year slightly, a change in government position around fare increases across both London and the National Rail network in response to what happens for inflation? Yeah. What's going to happen to energy costs? Yeah, are we going to? Yeah, is there going to be, you know, more move away from Russian sources of energy? You know, is there going to be, hopefully, we all hope, an end to the war and, you know, some part of the negotiations there? You know, what is going to happen to inflation? You know, I don't think there's kind of any particular point at which we're going to really be able to say.
That's the question I was asking. Do you feel that any of these uncertainties will solidify? You're saying they won't. Let me move on to the ultra-low emission zone extension. How much is it going to cost to extend the ultra-low emission zone? And will this reserve fund be adequate to cover that cost?
So, obviously, where we are, as you'll appreciate, is that the Mayor's asked TfL to prepare a consultation, and so they're doing that, and they're running they're looking at things in the next level of detail in order to inform that consultation. So their previous work suggested that the cost of implementation would range between £225 million and £275 million. And we'd obviously, as the Mayor has said, be looking to offer a scrappage scheme on top of that.
What happens if the cost is more? Where does any extra money come from? Because expanding the zone this time, from an administrative point of view, is a significantly larger situation. There's many more places to enter and leave. Is the plan to just put more cameras up? Is that going to work? How much is it going to cost?
So I think it's important to remember that obviously TfL have considered this in producing those estimates that I just gave you. It's important to remember, of course, that we have a low emission zone already in place on the Greater London boundary, which provides a level of cameras and other infrastructure already. Absolutely, it will need to be augmented, and that's reflected in those costs.
Okay. The Mayor's final budget states that the reserve will be used to fund infrastructure projects to improve London's air quality and the environment. Mm-hmm. So far, we know about the expansion of the ultra-low emission zone. What other projects does the Mayor have in mind?
So, as I've said, I think the priority we've got there is about, firstly, ensuring TfL can have a balanced budget. Secondly, as you say, Assembly Member, around any further schemes to address congestion, the climate emergency and air pollution. What the Mayor has said is that he's asked TfL to prepare to consult on the expansion of ULEZ to the Greater London boundary. He's also said that he foresees by the end of the decade that London will need a smart road user charging scheme in place. There's nothing else, I don't think, that would kind of fall into the category you're talking about.
So are you suggesting this money would be to deliver smart road charging?
No, I'm not. I'm suggesting that this money will be to, as I say, firstly, £61 million of it is already in TfL's budget, the council tax side. Beyond that, the considerations are, number one, ensuring TfL can balance its budget. Number two, costs of the Greater London ULEZ, if that following consultation is taken forward, and associated scrappage. And obviously we're talking to government about all of that. And then, beyond that, we still have to deal with the fact that TfL's in a managed decline situation.
No, but you were the person who entered the idea of road charging. What you made it relevant to this question, to this budget. Does the Mayor have a plan to pay for, study, whatever, out of these monies?
So as the Mayor said, that he sees smart road user charging needs to happen in London by the end of the decade. So that's clearly quite a few. There are quite a few years there that are beyond the current planning window, and yeah, these like the kind of longer term things about that. And when costs associated with such a scheme might need to come in is something that will get thought about as TfL does its business planning. Which
I understand that, but you were the person who said road pricing would be part of this, not me. You said that.
No, I didn't say that, Assembly Member. You were asking me if it was.
No, I asked you the question. Let me be clear. I asked you the question, what other projects would this money look at? And you were the person who entered the idea of road pricing, not me. So I ask you the very simple question, will this money be used to study, deliver road charging? It's not a trick question, it's just a question.
No, it's not intended for that purpose.
Thank you. That was all I needed to know. Just to go back to the zone, how many times larger will this zone be than the current zone, the expansion?
I couldn't tell you that.
Okay. What method of tracking are we looking to use? Will it just be cameras? Are we looking to do anything different? Just
I believe it will just be cameras, but again, TfL will set all that out in the consultation document that they're working on.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Fortune.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, Assembly Member Bailey covered it off what I was going to come in on. So.
Assembly Member Clark.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Good morning, David. What will be the compliance rate initially of the expanded ELAs, and how quickly will this be expected to increase?
Good morning. So where we are at the moment is we've got compliance within the existing North and South Circular Zone 93%, and Outer London compliance is currently 82.5%. Now, we recognise that compliance is naturally increasing over time, so we won't expect that were this scheme, again subject to consultation, to come in some point in 23. We expect that 82.5% to have risen, and so that's that latest TfL in the consultation will take the latest learnings from what's happened with the expansion to North and South Circular, which of course is only 5 months old now, and so they'll take that latest learning when they prepare the consultation document.
Okay, and as vehicles become more compliant and more, people replace their cars and that sort of thing, how will that impact on the income levels?
So absolutely, the income levels will fall over time. I don't have the latest TfL forecasts on that in front of me, but that's what we would expect to happen. And it's important to remember that both for the Mayor and legally, road user charging schemes are there for transport policy reasons, and receiving less income is a success because it means our air's clearer because the polluting vehicles aren't out there.
Yeah, thanks. And what is the anticipated impact on inequality?
So TfL worked on that and published the document that went to the government. They published that, I think, last Friday. So and again, all this will be looked at again and refined for the formal consultation. They expect that it will lead to NOx emissions reducing by 280 to 330 tonnes, and CO2 emissions will fall by 135,000 to 150,000 tonnes.
Okay. And do you factor in costs on other public bodies as part of your business case? For example, what impact the improvements will have on the NHS?
So there will be a full, as part of preparing the consultation, there will be a full integrated impact assessment done in the normal way, which will consider all the things it needs to do, in particular impact on people with protected characteristics.
Okay, and is this the most cost-effective way to improve air quality?
we believe it is, and it's a balance, of course, between achieving the policy benefits in terms of reducing emissions, whilst minimising the impact on Londoners, recognising that we are in a cost of living crisis. There are other measures that could have been brought forward, but they probably would have spread charges across more Londoners, and probably they'd be smaller charges, and they wouldn't have had that same impact on pollution.
Okay, thank you very much.
That document's now public, so colleagues can go and read all the detail there. Okay,
thank you, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Can I quickly ask you, what level of income will the extension generate?
I think it's fair to say that will vary year to year. It will be obviously, if it goes ahead, it will depend when in 23-24 the scheme starts, because it will only have a part-year effect, and then full-year effect, and we expect it to be relatively high at first and then declining. I don't have specific numbers. TfL are looking at that again as part of the consultation that they're preparing, and as I say, taking the latest learnings from the expansion of the ultra-low emission zone, because as we would know, it was more successful than we expected it to be in terms of changing people's behaviour, reducing pollution, which then meant we actually received in the first few months less income from it than we had expected.
Okay, but you must have a broad idea, broad brush.
We do. It's a range. I'll be honest, I don't have it in front of me because TfL are reviewing it again.
No, I understand that, and I won't keep you to the pennies or even the pounds, but approximately, give us a flavour of what you're expecting.
So TfL has included in its budget for as a full year for 24-25 £300 million. Now we know that there's a range of outcomes, but we don't at this stage don't think that's an unreasonable thing to budget for that year.
300 million. Okay. Assembly Member Bailey, you just wanted to very quickly.
Very quick question. You gave the tonnage reduction in NOx and CO2. What is that in percentage terms?
Go back to my table. I'm sorry, I don't have that. We'll have to write on that.
If you could write to us on that, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Fortune.
Thank you very much, Chair. So just to establish some numbers for context. So the compliance rate in Inner London at the moment is about 92%. Is that right?
93, yes.
93%, okay. And then we are thinking that in Greater London, currently it's about 82%.
Outer London is 82.
Yeah,
Greater
London.
Greater London, somewhere between the two is a blended average.
So Outer London, we're looking at 82%. Okay. So, because what I'm trying to work out is that when the camera scheme goes in, there's an inevitability and a hope, right, for its redundancy at some point. I was just looking at my phone. I resisted these smartphones for years, but it got to a point where I didn't have a choice, and it will become like that with vehicles. We're hoping, won't it?
Yeah. So it will be. Yeah. It will, I guess, over time, these polluting vehicles will not be available. I mean, the government has set, is it 2030 as the latest that combustion engine vehicles will be available for new vehicles for sale. So absolutely, over time, that will change.
Which is good, because the air quality side of this is the budget meeting, but the air quality side of this needs to be deeply considered, and I know that's. By the way, I'm statutory bound, Luke, as the member for Bexley and Bromley, to comment on how well you're dressed. That was an instruction I had for these meetings. So we've got this expansion of cameras, which is for that air quality, but there is the economic and the budgetary side of it. And we're thinking that because of the improvement in vehicles, it will get to a point where these cameras will be almost redundant, or there'll be a very small percentage of cars that are not compliant.
Yeah. So
that'll be a logical process.
So you will absolutely, as a logical point, one day, every vehicle will will comply with the current
Like you don't see any
standards.
fat phones anymore, or dumb phones, whatever they're called. You don't see them anymore
Yeah.
because you can't get them.
Yeah.
Right. On the few people that have them are because they can't afford to change their contract, or they don't use it for all those times. So they've just got it because they can't transition very easily. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
Which is why we're putting in a scrappage scheme to be funded appropriately to support those people that need the help to transition. Mm-hmm. So on that scrappage scheme, could we just deal into that, and I'll come back to my main thrust. So what would the scrappage scheme look like in terms of current thinking? And how would that be funded?
So in terms of current thinking, I mean, clearly it needs to be targeted on those who need the help. A starting point would be something on a similar basis to the scrappage schemes the Mayor has already offered. But as I say, there's a consultation. We're very open to other ideas if colleagues have them about ways that would support people who find themselves in the situation you describe. And so absolutely would welcome suggestions about that, and that can then get tied up into the final decision. In terms of funding, I mean, let's be honest, this is difficult. The Mayor has put, if my memory serves, £61 million into the existing scrappage schemes, which he's had to fund entirely himself with no funding from the government, at a time when we know the government has provided clearer funding for scrappage schemes and so forth to Manchester, to Birmingham, to Coventry, to Portsmouth, and the list goes on, but the government has refused to do so for London. So we are engaging with the government again and looking for their support, recognising the scale of what we're trying to do.
I mean, that's a familiar narrative. We had that yesterday. So just as a point of clarity, the Mayor didn't fund it himself. The Mayor funds it with grant money from government, and government doesn't have any money either. That's money that comes from taxpayers.
No. Well,
so it's not, it is a point of fact.
It's taxing. It's taxing.
It's taxation. It's not the Mayor funding it himself.
Well,
so what I'm worried about...
It's the Mayor's money. The Mayor is given discretion on how to spend it.
It's the Mayor's money. That's an interesting viewpoint. So what I'm worried about is that there's the promise of a scrappage scheme which goes alongside the expansion of ULEZ, but actually there isn't the commitment to controlling the funding for that scrappage scheme because it's reliant on government grant. So it's like saying, we're going to have a scrappage scheme as long as someone else pays for it. So I said, I'll take my kids to Disneyland as long as someone else pays for it. If we're going to do that expansion, we're going to have that reliance on a scrappage scheme. So the people that really need the support, the people, the businesses, the charities, they need that confidence that it's properly funded. And your own figures that there's 82% compliance, and the natural transition rate of people transitioning anyway, can we commit to make sure that money's available?
So the Mayor is determined to offer a scrappage scheme. How it is funded in terms of the level of support available from government and ensuring parity of treatment with the rest of the country versus what the Mayor's able to from his own resources, and the other challenges that we face on that front, as set out earlier in the meeting, are absolutely things that we've got to work through yet, and it's premature at this stage to say, right, this is precisely how it will be funded. Okay.
So we've got the compliance rates. The compliance rates. Those compliance rates are increasing. At what point do we think that expanded camera network becomes almost redundant? And then what's the cost of keeping it and maintaining it? What's the financial tail on it? And what purpose does it then serve once those compliance rates have increased to as high as they're going to get?
So those are really questions for Transport for London, not for me. I'm getting a bit expert and technical. Obviously, with any such scheme, things will the measures have to be in there until you're confident that non-compliance is so low that there's no risk of kind of going back to a world of higher non-compliance. And at that stage,
that would be impossible, wouldn't it? That would be like transitioning back to petrol vehicles.
Absolutely. And I think there will come a point at which frankly the petrol stations is not an economic business to be in, and thus people will have to get out of having a petrol vehicle because they won't be able to fuel them.
Yeah.
Or it will just be, leaving aside all the other problems we've got at the moment, it will just become a very, very expensive thing to do because the economies of scale that would be in the provision of petrol as a fuel will disappear.
I agree with you. So we've got, there's a considerable expense in putting in this technological infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And that considerable expense is meeting a challenge on polluting vehicles that's in a sort of a downward trajectory. Mm-hmm. There's already quite high compliance there's relatively high compliance in outer London, and we appreciate that more people drive in outer London than inner London. We've established that with Centre for London data. There's going to be support, and I appreciate your honesty. I'm not trying to trick you. People want to know the answer. I appreciate your honesty that there will be a funding package available from the Mayor of London. He will then be asking the government for some extra support to top that up if required, to help that extra push to transition those last few vehicles. And then we will reach a point where you can't buy a polluting vehicle. We've got as high a transition rate as possible, and the very expensive camera network that's going to require, there's going to be a tail to that expense, right? Mm-hmm. So then it comes down to, so that's quite expensive for a limited time frame. So the question's going to be, isn't it, going back to the air quality issue, is actually what's the benefit and reduction of that air quality and that difference that we can make above and beyond the natural transition rate, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, if you just put a scrappage scheme in and didn't spend hundreds of £1 million on the cameras, would we see a similar benefit?
So, I mean, again, this is a question for TfL policy experts, not really for me. But I think it's fairly clear that what the ULEZ has been, and the fact that people know ULEZ is coming, has already driven increased compliance. Like in terms
I do get that, honestly, David. I'm not trying to trick you. But this is the budget meeting, so it's how do we best allocate those resources to get the outcome that we want. The outcome that we want, that everybody who's right thinking would want, was that air quality is better. Yeah. So what's the best way of allocating that to get that outcome? Could it be the fact that you just do a scrappage scheme without spending all the money? Maybe you could top up the scrappage scheme if you're going to get the natural transition to cleaner vehicles, and people that can't afford it, charities, businesses that can't afford it, are assisted to transition, then you might get that compliance rate. Could you put the money into supporting the electric buses, so you increase the number of electric buses? Could that resource be put somewhere else other than a camera network that is going to become redundant within 10 years?
Yeah. So the point there, so firstly, let's just remind ourselves before lawyers have a go at me that any RUC scheme has to be brought forward on transport policy grounds, not on financial grounds. But then, having taken the decision it's the right thing to do in policy grounds, then you can look at the financial impact. Yeah. Now, what we know is that the cost of implementing the scheme are in terms of the range that I talked about earlier, are clearly going to get met, even if income from the scheme is lower than what TfL have budgeted at the moment. It will get met over time. So, the cost of implementing the scheme basically will be covered by the proceeds from it. So, if we decided not to do Greater London ULEZ, and of course, it's going to be a consultation, no decision's been made yet. If we decide not to do Greater London ULEZ, then it's not like, oh, you've got the maybe £250 million cost of the camera network and on the back office systems and etc. Let's go and spend that on something else, because that money will essentially, absent government support for it, be getting picked up from the income from the scheme.
But the income from the scheme is going to be very limited.
But it's going to be great. It's going to be greater than the costs of setting up the camera network.
So you think that the revenue that will come in from people in that outer London zone will wash the face of the camera network, and not just capital costs, revenue costs, right?
Yeah, because as we know, said already, the revenues will go up and then will decline over time. But if you want to look at it in a financial context, even on the kind of most worst case scenario I think TfL can come up with, that revenue across multiple years is definitely going to exceed the cost of installing the camera network and the systems and then the ongoing maintenance and operations.
TfL can come up with some pretty worst case scenarios. I've noticed that in my first year.
Indeed.
But it's an ultra low emission zone, not a ultra loads of camera zone. So if what we're trying to achieve is that air quality improving, what I'm saying is it's not necessarily connected. That is just an expansion of cameras. And if we need the expansion of cameras to generate the cash available to improve the air quality, then perhaps it needs another look at.
Sorry, you've lost me there.
So my point that I made to you was that if you've got the natural transition to cleaner vehicles, if you've got scrappage schemes in place that will help people transition, this goes right back to 5 minutes ago, do you need to do the expansion of cameras? Do you need to spend the money for the expansion of cameras in order to drive that forward? Could you not use that revenue, could you not use that money, rather, somewhere else? The answer that you gave me was that you sort of need that because there's a revenue generated that's going to pay for it, it washes its own face, etc. Is that roughly what you said?
In terms of the costs of this, the financially, we expect the scheme to be a net financial positive because the income from it will exceed the costs. But I don't think that's quite the point you're driving at. What you're basically driving at is, well, what happens if we don't do it? And I think the reality is that any realistic...
Sorry, just because I don't want you to waste your time doing that. I'm not saying what happens if we don't do it. I'm saying, is there a better way to achieve the outcome we want, which is better air quality? That's why I suggested a higher scrappage scheme, helping more people transition vehicles, investment in electric buses. Is there a better way of spending that cash?
I think so. The challenge you've got is, I guess in most things, it's kind of, what is the driver for people, apologies for the pun, for people to upgrade their vehicle? Now, if you can get support from a scrappage scheme, then that's great, isn't it? But quantum of funding for a scrappage scheme for expansion of Greater London ULEZ is clearly an unknown. It's a future decision, so we can't really debate that. But if you talk about just what's happened already, well, we've got facts. We know that the scrappage scheme was really important to those that it helped, but it is now spent up its money, and there are more people who would have liked to benefit from that. And so you can't if you're going to you could reasonably ask TfL, right, well, what scale of scrappage scheme are you going to need to achieve the same emission reductions? But I don't have the figures, but all my experience tells me it's going to be very, very significant. You need the thing that drives the behavioural change, which is the daily charge.
And I'll wrap up, sorry, Chair. So the argument is that by threatening people with a charge, that will force them to transition vehicles.
It creates the impetus by which they need to do it.
So who are we threatening?
Rather than say, oh, there's a scrappage scheme across there that I could apply to if I feel like it. But actually, I'm quite all right with with my car. I don't, I've got other priorities in my life at the moment, and so it creates that impetus. And I think that was what we've seen already, is that people's knowledge, where they've known, for instance, that ULEZ was being expanded to North and South Circular, led to them to behaviour changes and people moving their vehicles earlier and outside the scrappage scheme. And I personally know people who've done that. I'm sure other colleagues here do as well.
Okay, I'll leave it there because I'm taking time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Assembly Member Pigeon.
Yeah, you mentioned there was the paper that's gone to government that was out last week. It would be good if that link could be circulated to us, because I had missed that. But in terms of your allocation for this stream of work, We've talked about the scrappage scheme, which is an important part of it, but how much of the budget is going to be allocated to the idea of mobility credits, the idea instead of getting someone to replace one vehicle with another, that actually we're giving them credit so they can use public transport, join the car club, the bike car scheme and so on, because this scheme is about a policy objective, but actually using public transport more and all those other things is also about achieving that. I'm wondering how much of that will be going into mobility credits, please.
I mean, that's absolutely what we, the sort of thing we need to think about. It's referred to earlier. We could just do a scrappage scheme exactly as done before, and just, it's a question of how much money to allocate into it. Or you could say, well, let's use part of the available resources for I don't really know how to say traditional scrappage scheme, but you know what I mean. And then, use some of the other money that could have gone into that for some of the things you described or other ideas. So, that's absolutely something that can be considered, and we'll look at ideas, and ultimately, if the mayor takes the decision to proceed with this expansion, then we would have to think about what the right balance between those ideas is. But we're not kind of at the point where we're trying to take those decisions yet.
It's under consideration, but you haven't worked out allocations yet, but it's certainly in the mix.
Yeah, we need to start by, getting very clear on the scheme itself, and then you can start looking at the package around it, and also as part of that, the funding situation becomes clearer.
Great, thank you.
Assembly Member Hirani.
Thank you. Just wanted to probe a bit more on scrappage schemes, actually. Has there been any further conversations with government on how we can get that support for scrappage schemes in London?
Yeah, it's a live discussion at the moment.
And are we also talking to car manufacturers, just bearing in mind, I know there's a sort of doing down London at the moment and spreading of resources across the country at the moment from the levelling up agenda. But car manufacturing and plants in the UK, for example, could also benefit, and manufacturing in this country could benefit across the whole country as a result of a scrappage scheme and a national scheme to help manufacture, much like there was, I think, around after the economic crash, where the impetus wasn't the environment, but it was on boosting manufacturing and jobs in this country. So has there been sort of talk to maybe go hand in hand with some of the manufacturers in terms of lobbying on this?
Yeah. So I think at the moment that's a difficult avenue to pursue, because the situation we're in, obviously the impacts of COVID and this country Brexit impacts as well, rippling out through, and with the issues about semiconductors, there's as I understand it, there's very real issues about the availability of new cars to meet current demand. I even heard it suggested that for some cars, used vehicles are now getting more expensive than new, which seemed very very counterintuitive to say the least. But that at the moment, I think manufacturers' concern is actually meeting the demand that exists, not trying to find ways to boost demand.
Thank you. And obviously that's thinking about new cars, which fewer Londoners will be able to afford. But you can get a plethora of second-hand cars that are ULEZ compliant. I mean, I don't buy the argument around not having a charge, and I think that should be scrapped right away. Because if I had a gas-guzzling Range Rover, if I was fortunate to be able to afford one, and it came to the decision I make for my next vehicle, someone in that position I think would just buy the same type of vehicle, which will still be gas guzzling, rather than a cleaner vehicle if they weren't going to be paying a penalty for daily use for it. But have we also looked at other innovative ideas, like maybe talking to car finance companies to have more generous deals or 0% deals on second-hand vehicles to help people who can't afford that upfront cost, who may be able to actually afford a new vehicle, but maybe the upfront cost is a bit too much for them, and they may not be eligible for the scrappage schemes? Are we looking at ideas where we can actually bring the industry and sector on board to hopefully help and ease people make that transition?
Yeah, so I mean, we're obviously very happy, through the consultation, to look at any ideas for different ways of support to people. essentially, if ultimately what I think car finance people and car manufacturers would say that they're in a competitive market and they're being as competitive as they can be already. It then becomes a question about, well, do you wish to put public subsidy into new vehicles? And I'm sure a case can be made for that. Equally, a case can be made against that in terms of, all new vehicles have even electric vehicles have some negative environmental impact, and we have to be mindful that there are a great many Londoners who survive without a car, and so we need to take all those things into the round. But obviously, if people in the consultation have proposals to make, we'll happily look at them.
Thank you. But final point. I do like the idea of sort of transport credits and seeing if the money can be used elsewhere by people. One thing that has come up locally in my area is elderly people who may have the means, who may have actually the funds and may not need a scrappage scheme per se, but the bureaucracy and the effort taken to do the paperwork to change the vehicle just seems a bit daunting for them. And this is something maybe you're going to refer me to the consultation again, but would TfL or the Mayor be supportive of maybe a scheme which just handholds people through that process who might be happy to change their vehicle, may be able to change their vehicle, but just need a bit of help and guidance to go through all the details that's needed to change their vehicle?
Again, it is certainly something that can be thought about. Whether there's a role for boroughs there is something that could be considered. Obviously we would always welcome feedback on the scrappage scheme in terms of was it as well structured and as with the minimal necessary level of administration. And so, if colleagues from their constituents had any feedback on the scheme, I'm sure TfL would be pleased to receive that.
So I want to be clear, I wasn't talking about the scrappage scheme and eligibility. I'm thinking about people who may be able to afford a vehicle but just need sort of a bit of hand-holding to just guide them through that process of changing or giving up their vehicle completely.
Yeah, and so if you have constituents who come to you and say, well, I did it, but I found this part of the process was difficult or unclear, well, that's feedback that TfL should welcome, so that we can, the first goal has to be ensure that, the process is always as clear and straightforward as it can be. And then, yes, right, then there's the question, may some people need some support around that?
Okay, thank you. We're moving on. Okay, Assembly Member Bailey, we are running very behind time.
Discipline. Firstly, I think the key question needs to be answered is the delta between the natural rate of compliance changing, because of course the government changed the law ages ago about Euro 6 cap and all the rest of that, and the change that the congestion, the ULEG's expansion would force. That's the figure we need to understand. And to pick up Crippresh's point, Assemblymember Crippresh, is that if we want manufacturers to talk to this, could the Mayor just directly write to them as part of the consultation? Because obviously if you're an international manufacturer, you're probably not sitting there waiting for the consultation, but you would answer if you were asked. And the other thing, Assemblymember, is that you can't buy certainly a brand new uncompliant car because the law has changed. So every car that's changed will give you a compliant car. Back to you, Chair.
Okay, we're going on to GLA Green Bond. As I just mentioned, we're nearly an hour into it and only halfway through our first section. So if we could pick up the pace a bit and please make sure everything is directed towards a budget question. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So yes, we're picking up now on the Green Bond programme, which was announced in February this year. So questions for Luke. So the first question really is just, what are the plans for this £90 million climate emergency funding? The original press release for the green bonds noted that they would address issues like fuel poverty. So is this going to lead to investment in Londoners' homes? to provide more insulation and renewable energy?
Potentially, but that may be indirect in its impact. So the idea is that of the 90 that was announced, around 4 million is available for essentially financial research and development to bring investment opportunities to market. So that wouldn't necessarily be a deployment of GLA or indeed public sector money. That would be to make it easier for private sector providers of capital, pension funds, insurers, these sort of investors, to deploy money into initiatives that will have the kind of impacts that we're discussing. There may be some scope for that money to also support initiatives for retail investors, so for individual Londoners or indeed others to invest in the improvement of energy efficiency in homes, for instance. So that's the sort of smaller part of the chunk of money. The 86 million is specifically tied to the green bond programme itself. And we're in the process of beginning to develop the pipeline of potential projects for the deployment of the green bond proceeds. My expectation is that the majority of that would be done within the GLA group, but we'll be potentially working with other public sector partners too. And what the 86 million is for, it will be to make projects that might otherwise be marginal or financially unviable at the moment viable. So we will need to go through a prioritisation exercise when we start receiving effectively the bids for potential projects for this programme, and we'll decide then what will be the most efficient way to allocate that funding based on the carbon reduction impact and payback period that these projects have. So the money could be used in a variety of ways, depending on the needs of the specific project. It could, for instance, be used to subsidise the first few years of interest and principal repayments, or it could be used to reduce the interest rate at the project level over the entire life of that project. So there'll be some flexibility as to how it's deployed.
And you're expecting that 86 million to bring in, was it 500 million?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously there have been some changes in the world's economy, and that's led through to interest rates. But at the time that was written, that 86 million was pretty close to the full life finance costs of that sum of money. So it's probably a slightly lower number now, given our expectations for interest rates. And obviously it will depend on how quickly the money is repaid as well. So
will there be an update on those expectations? Because obviously, you know, we don't know what's going to happen to interest rates over this next period, but it's certainly not, you know, it's not looking optimistic and rosy for low-cost borrowing.
Correct.
So, are you going to? Will there be a sort of a
yes,
re-evaluation of that project and what that 86 million can deliver?
Certainly, it is something we'll keep continuing under review. But to update it meaningfully, we really need to have more oversight of the pipeline of potential projects, because yes, as a result of movement in interest rates, and I expect that is likely to be the case, that news will get worse rather than better there. The amount of funding that sum of money could subsidise would be smaller. But if we have a series of projects that don't require as much subsidy, we may still be able to do 500 or indeed considerably more. So the hope would be that we're identifying things that need as little subsidy as possible, but have the maximum impact on carbon emissions.
One of the things that you're also facing is raised energy costs.
Yes.
And I think it was David earlier mentioned Transport for London having very high energy costs. Now, back in 2019, I raised with the Mayor that TfL procures only 0.01% renewable energy. And the Mayor said that he was going to get involved in some power purchase agreements, which is a mechanism for delivering more new renewable energy
Yes.
projects. So it's not buying renewable energy, it's actually investing in projects that are shovel-ready, and that actually means there is a greater quantum of renewable energy in the world. Now, do you think that, given energy costs rising in the way that they are, that actually perhaps what this money could be being usefully invested in would be power purchase agreements, so that you are kind of really tackling the climate emergency, the net zero 2030 commitments, by actually investing in new renewable energy projects?
Yeah, I think that they're quite separate initiatives, and I should also say that by design I'm slightly ill-informed on the status of the PPA discussions within TfL, because we put up a Chinese wall between the procurement team in Transport for London, who are looking at that process from the consumer side, and my team, who are exactly doing as you say, looking at setting up an investment facility to allocate potentially some of our own group money, just as general investments, because we invest in renewable energy just for Treasury management purposes anyway. So some of our own money, but also working with our private sector and institutional investment partners. So the idea would be that we would invest in the successful projects that would be supplying renewable energy to Transport for London and ideally other members of the group. But we don't need subsidy for that. That is a standalone commercially viable endeavour. So that's separate from the Green Bond Programme. However, what the energy price environment does do at the moment is really highlight the value of savings from installation efficiency and so forth. So if anything, yes, whilst interest rates are, the increase there is perhaps unhelpful to our ambitions in this regard, the increase in energy costs makes it even more imperative for the organisations that we're working with to save money. And so actually the business case for retrofit is substantially enhanced by higher energy prices.
Mm-hmm. And just to pick up again on the power purchase agreements and TfL, because that is still a budget thing, even if it doesn't relate to the green bond thing, is TfL actively looking at increasing its procurement of renewable energy? Just wanted to.
I can come in, Caroline, and sort of help Luke's conflict of interest here. I mean, there's a huge and separate stream, as Luke's explained, between the PPA and the use of the 90 million.
Yes, no, I do get that, but I'm just interested, given the escalation of energy costs, it feels like it's something that TfL should be. And
since the Mayor's commitment back in 2019, there's been a huge amount of work that we've been doing, led by TfL, but also across the group. So the idea is very much that we will piggyback on the TfL's PPAs across the group, so involving the Met, who obviously got a considerable set of issues as well, but also bringing in ourselves and the MDCs. So there's a lot of work we're doing with the Collaboration Board, which has been funded separately through the Collaboration Board under David. And very much so, as Luke, I think, started to allude to, I mean, the concept we have here is very much that the energy that we purchase through the PPAs will be, as green as possible. And that's, part of the motivation. And so very much this is aligned to, the whole the Mayor's addressing of the whole climate emergency.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to go back to Luke and the green bonds. The 86 million, is that, why is that the right figure? Why is it 86 million? And how exactly is that green bond programme going to work?
Sure. As 86 million, the allocation, I would defer to David and David to discuss. But I mean, at the time of writing, that sum of money, if you assume that the money would be repaid in a sort of mortgage style with a small amount each year over the life of the expected projects, that sum of money was equal to the expected interest costs. So there's a symmetry there between that number and the 500 million that was discussed in the release. But as I say, there are a lot of moving parts with how far that could go, and it all depends on the level of subsidy required, if any, for the eligible projects.
And what exactly will the initiative be delivering in 22-23?
In 22-23, I mean, I think it'd be preemptive to describe what the successful projects might be, but retrofit we would hope would form a large part of it, and there could also be initiatives like district heat networks that are covered, but we'll have to go through that process of collating. As I say, there's bids from around the group and potentially from London boroughs and other public sector partners too, and we would hope to be coming up with a proposed initial allocation towards the middle of the next financial year, so kind of end of September time.
Okay, so end of September we can expect to be looking at.
We would certainly have a substantial update
on what's
what
going
our plans
on.
might be. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Hirani.
Just quickly on that, do you, sorry, Luke, do you anticipate then the projects will have differing redemption rates? So some might be 5-year projects, some might be 20-year projects, so it'll all be sort of depending on the bids that come in. Okay, thanks. Just looking for clarification on that. And does the GLA have the capacity and experience to deliver initiatives on this scale?
In terms of the underlying projects, or no, in terms of raising the bond?
In terms of the bond.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, this is something that we've done before. We've raised a 600 million bond for Crossrail. We raised a 200 million bond in 2015 towards our contribution to the Northern Line extension. Whenever we borrow, we always evaluate the available sources of funding, so bonds are always something that we consider, so it is part of business as usual. It just so happens those have been the only instances where we concluded it was absolutely the most cost-effective way to proceed. But it would be our expectation that given the current investment environment and the shift in portfolios of institutional investors towards investments with strong ESG characteristics, the demand for green bonds is very high presently, and it would be our expectation that compared to like-for-like, financially like-for-like borrowing in terms of a given repayment period and a given amount of money, if we can demonstrate strong green characteristics to the use of proceeds, the cost of borrowing should be lower. And
I think David's eager to come in as well.
Yeah, if I could just add to what Luke has said. I mean, not only obviously the experience that Luke and the team bring internally, but obviously we'll be using book runners in terms of issuing a bonds issue. So we will go out to the market in terms of then the issuance of the bond by utilising obviously the expertise we need to bring in as well. So, yes, we've got a great team internally, it's experienced and has a presence in the market, but also obviously we will use the necessary, private sector as necessary to ensure we can get the bond at the best price and effect.
Great. And is there a reason why that route has been chosen through the private sector in the bonds process rather than sort of the public sector borrowing schemes that are available? Is there a difference in the repayment rates, and the percentages?
There's a lot more flexibility in terms of going to the capital markets through a bond. We can tailor both the drawdown of proceeds and the repayment exactly to our needs. We can also reflect the market demand. So if we take the 200 million bond that we did for the Northern Line extension, that was a highly bespoke transaction because it just so happened that the requirements of the pensions insurer, who was on the other side of that deal, and ours were very complementary. So we both wanted exactly what the other had to offer, and so we were able to achieve very, very keen pricing as a result of that. Whereas the public sector borrowing options are administratively very convenient, so they're cheap to deliver, and often the rates are very competitive too, but there's a very rigid set of structures available which may not give us the flexibility we need, given the fact that we're going to be here delivering across a portfolio of projects all that have very different payback periods and so on.
again, just to add, I mean, it's obviously a second-order issue to the green money we're raising to address the climate change. But essentially, as a second-order issue, you know, we will go where it's best value for money, and which is why we haven't issued bonds since 2016, because the government has actually had more favourable rates. So as and when we're at a point of actually what money do we want to actually raise, well, then we'll look at issues between PWB, the Municipal Bond Agency, as against our own going to private markets. So, you know, it is driven by best value for money to support that climate agenda being addressed.
Right, and what is there any sort of market engagement? What kind of market engagement have you been taking part with to, to sort of finesse this issue?
We organised a roundtable a couple of months ago to discuss this with a range of institutional investors. In the course of my day-to-day life, I'm talking to CIOs of institutional investors, and this is a topic that I raise as a sort of warm-up. Obviously, when we have more clarity on the projects that the proceeds are going to be deployed towards, then we'll start formal market engagement. Whereas David says we'll typically appoint one or two banks to be our book runners and do a lot of the legwork in terms of setting up the sales meetings, and then we'll roadshow and talk to the market in great detail. But yeah, people know it's coming, and it's a question of then incrementally releasing more information as our plans crystallise.
Great. And given that was 2 months ago, I'm hoping that, given obviously the situation in Russia and you're looking at sort of ethical investment and making sure that you're putting those checks and balances in the people who are involved and investing as well.
Yeah, there's a thorough KYC with any financial counterparty. Know your client process with any financial counterparty that we work with.
Great. And when can we expect to see some sort of framework which sets out the principles of the green bond and the criteria for which expenditures are eligible to be financed?
We're working on that detail over the next 3 months as we work with the functional bodies and other partners to get an early view of the projects. In terms of a formal update, we would be hoping to pull together a prospectus for the green bond. So that's essentially the master document that we would release publicly, and then subsequently we would do individual bond transactions under that programme. We'd hope to be creating that document towards the early part of the second half of the financial year, so October, November time, that should be available.
Great. And you've already mentioned some key risks around this, around inflation and energy prices. Are there any others that you can identify, and what's been done to manage these?
So those are indeed key risks, but probably the biggest risk in terms of the green bond element of our overall green finance programme is public sector funding, because we are envisaging that the majority of those proceeds will be going towards things either within the group or potentially with London boroughs or other London public bodies. And so clearly we have some capacity with that 86 million to subsidise things, but we will be relying on the financial resources of others to have maximum impact.
Thank you. Assembly Member Pigeon.
Thank you. Can you just clarify the Northern Line extension bond you issued? Luke, you've said 2015. David, you've said 2016. When we met Monday, I made a note 2013. When was that actually issued?
It was May 2015.
May 2015?
Yes.
Okay. But that's still, if you're going to be issuing next year, 8 years ago that you last actually did a transaction of this kind. So whilst I have no doubt your professional qualifications, it's still rather dated experience. Things have changed a lot since then. Will you be getting in additional absolute expertise to help you with this? Because this is quite a risky project.
Yeah, I think in terms of the marketing process, the role of the bank book runners that we appoint is pretty significant, and obviously the people in the debt capital markets teams of the the banks that are likely to be successful from this process will be doing bond roadshows every week, so that they're very their experience will be very, very much up to date. But whilst it's a long while since we've transacted, I would advance that that's not the last time that I've engaged with the market. I have roles outside City Hall, which I'm raising funds all the time for other projects. So those conversations with investors are something that are certainly very familiar to me. And in terms of the team here at City Hall, they're obviously still very much involved in communication with investors who hold our existing bonds. So we have an idea of what people want, and they're also involved with exactly the same people who'll be making the decision whether or not to buy these bonds. The team are working with them on other investment projects. Many of the people who are potentially likely to be interested in acquiring these bonds are also institutions that we might invest with in the short term in the course of our Treasury management activity.
Okay, so there's a lot of complexity there in terms of managing conflicts. But can you explain to us what the programme size will be for this investment?
So the programme size that we announce, we'll have to discuss that with whoever is the successful book runner. We'll also, without delving too much into financial complexity, those two bonds that I mentioned, the one for Crossrail and for the Northern Line extension, were issued by a platform which Lloyds Bank kindly set up for us, called Community Finance Company. The reason for that, there's a powers issue that is very specific to the GLA, that means we essentially need a subsidiary or a special purpose vehicle to actually issue the bonds, and then there's a back-to-back loan between us and them. We may use that platform again, but as David has said, the overarching priority for us as the finance officers is to deliver best value. So we're not wedded to that platform. It may be another, and so there are a number of stakeholders whose views would be involved in determining that. But it's ultimately a fairly arbitrary number, and it would be very large. It might be 5 billion, for instance, just to give us flexibility for the future.
Okay, and what sort of interest rate are you expecting to pay on this debt, and over what term?
Well, again, as David said, best value is the key criterion. So we wouldn't be paying more than the Public Works Loans Board, which is effectively the default public sector option for borrowing, is charging at the time. So I would expect that in absolute terms, unless there are further shocks in the interest markets, the kind of headline rates for these things may be around 3%. That could be more, but I think probably unlikely to be less at this stage. But like for like, we would be hoping that the price of this will be below whatever the alternatives are, as a result of having those green credentials and therefore being very good investments for people to hold within ESG portfolios.
And finally, for me on this, in terms of our role, it's not just budget, it's performance as well. Can you just briefly outline the governance arrangements around the green bond and how the Assembly, how this committee is going to be able to scrutinise that to make sure we are getting best value, but also that the proper processes and governance around this is best practice?
So as we get closer to transaction, we'll obviously be writing up the business case internally. So before I recommend a transaction to David, then we'll be demonstrating why we think this is better than the alternatives, and we'll include that assessment in the next piece of Treasury management reporting. So that would be the obvious point for scrutiny. You do raise a very good point, though, that what would be new about this transaction compared to others is we will have to demonstrate that we have deployed the proceeds of this transaction towards genuinely green initiatives. So again, depending on what is the successful platform and who are the book runners we're working with, and which certification process they're using to denote this as a green bond. There'll be a set of reporting requirements that fall out of that, and we will be monitoring that on an ongoing basis over the life of the bond. So that probably would be a new thing that we would bring into Treasury reports from 2023-24 onwards.
Okay, and the governance.
If I could just add to what Lucas has said, I mean, obviously we are happy to engage you, the Assembly Committee, as appropriate in all these things. One word of caution, though, is because obviously some things can be very commercially sensitive, and the last thing we want to be doing is getting backed into a corner where there is public information about our exact intentions that actually backs us into a corner in terms of the market, and the market would then price that expectation. So, if we announce very boldly that we're going to issue a bond for 500 million at a particular date, then that then leads to all sorts of market expectations where we think we thought. So we just need to be kind of a little bit cautious around quite how we manage that engagement with you. So perhaps it might be a subject of other conversations, perhaps offline, on how we make the best effect to engage you in this very large project, but ensuring that we can do that without it potentially jeopardising the price that we get for the bond.
Yeah, of course, we understand that, but it's transparency, isn't it?
If I could make a brief plug for the team too, obviously to comply with the latest versions of the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy's Treasury Management Code, it's crucial that we maintain a programme of training for elected members. So we'd be very, very happy to include the kind of new green bond governance within that training programme from the next financial year onwards. So my team will be in touch with the committee officers and offer some dates for that over the forthcoming year.
Thank you. I think that sounds like something that we'd all like to take up. Thank you for that. And now we're really running late, colleagues. So we're going on to the section on MOPAC now. Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, panel. My questions are to you, David. I've got two questions. The first question will be in 4 parts. So it's about the additional £23.2 million allocated to MOPAC for initiatives to tackle violence. Firstly, can you tell us how this 23.2 million figure was determined? Secondly, what will it actually deliver? Thirdly, what are the targets against which this expenditure will be monitored? And lastly, have you got the resources in place to enable this level of additional expenditure?
Okay. Thank you, Assembly Member. I'll do what I can with that. So in terms of how is it determined, obviously the committee knows that keeping Londoners safe is the Mayor's top priority, and as it became apparent that there was going to be additional resources available, we asked MOPAC and VIU to put together a proposal about how what would best achieve that objective, and so the proposal was very much drawn up by the lead officers in those organisations based on their knowledge and experience. That then went through an initial process of scrutiny with myself, with the Deputy Chief of Staff, as part of the decision-making process in terms of the budget decisions. Obviously, you'll appreciate from some of the things both David Gallie talked about earlier and I think our previous discussions at committee, that those final decisions have to be really taken at pace, and that isn't really the time to be absolutely getting into the weeds of each individual little scheme. And so what we then do is, having got confirmation of the funding through the group budget process, we then start looking at it again in further detail to really ensure that the particular projects and initiatives within that framework are absolutely the right ones and the best use of that money. So that is a process that is ongoing at the moment, and there'll be a meeting shortly with the Mayor to take him through this and ensure that he's comfortable with that. And then, of course, beyond that, the actual allocation of the money comes through MOPAC's decision-making mechanism, and then the decisions will then set out very clearly the answers to your questions 2 and 3 in terms of what the projects are going to deliver and what they're targeted on, and what monitoring there will be in place. In terms of resources to deliver, we believe so. A number of the things we'll be funding will be external projects, and in some cases it will be about extending existing projects, so our partners will then be able to extend the contracts of the staff working on those schemes. In other cases it will be scaling up things and bringing them to boroughs where they may not already be, and then delivery partners will be looking to to scale up their resourcing accordingly.
Before I come to my second question, I mean, if you can, regarding points 2 and 3 of my about monitoring and the delivery, if you could sort of keep this committee informed, once you've spoken to the mayor.
Yeah. So, I mean, we will obviously, all the decisions will be published and to be available in the normal way. It's also worth flagging that, as well as ensuring that project proposals are evidence-based, what you will see is MOPAC publish on their website some of the evaluations of schemes, so that they don't just say, "Oh, right, well, we've done that and the boat sailed." They really do look at, for instance, there have been recent ones around London Gang Exit, and also evaluation of the Lighthouse project, and so they're there, and you colleagues can look at that and see the way that MOPAC goes about its evaluation and learning, which obviously then feeds into future decision making.
I mean, it's not just MOPAC, it's also the Violence Reduction Unit.
Well, yes, and they're as hosted by MOPAC, they're similar processes.
Just moving to the second question because of time. Very specifically, this £23.3 million, in terms of how it's going to be spent, how much of it will actually be spent on tackling youth violence, and how much on violence against women and girls?
Yeah. So the proposal is that £11.2 million is going for MOPAC and VRU work to tackle teen homicides, £5 million for violence against women and girls, and then the balance was £2 million into the Met's Project ADA, which is a Home Office initiative to counter drugs crime, and then £5 million on the Met Command and Control.
So that's 5, 7, 12. Okay, fine, that's good. Me breakdown. Yeah. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any concern that the Violence Reduction Unit will be able to spend the money in an appropriate timing? Because we've had all sorts of issues with the VRU.
I think my concern, if I'm honest, is so the VRU is primarily funded by a combination of the Mayor and the Home Office.
Yes.
And obviously it's great to have the Home Office funding. I'm in a difficult position in that I sit here now before you. I know privately the Home Office's funding decision for the VRU. Indeed, I've known it for over a month, but the Home Office is still yet to publicly announce that, and they've said that we're not allowed to talk about it in advance of that. And that is just, one of the challenges when you're taking external funding. You're bound by the decision making and the actions of the external funder. And I think one of the problems that the VRU has had to face is that, when money has come along and it's become available, obviously that it's really important that they get that money and they spend it. But at times there have been conditions about when that money must be spent by or what it must be spent on, which has meant the VRU has had to rejig their plans and use the Home Office money for certain things, and then the mayoral money, where we have more flexibility, then ends up almost picking up the additional things, and that just creates a very complicated landscape for all of us. And that's really why you've heard me say this before, you know, clear multi-year funding where we know where we are and we can plan is absolutely in everybody's best interests, both in terms of being able to deliver the best possible measures to tackle violence, but also in clarity and transparency to everybody about how the money is being used.
Yeah, I accept that. And in an ideal world, we'd all have budgets that we relied on. I absolutely get that. The only thing is, certainly in this committee and in the police committee, we have tried to get information around the VRU, Violence Reduction Unit, and had problems over the past and problems with KPIs, etc. Because of time, I can't go into that now, but it's certainly something I think we should revisit because we have had issues going forward on that. We're going to go to Crossrail now. Assembly Member Pigeon.
Thank you very much. In the Mayor's budget, 48.5 million was allocated to meet half the additional costs from the best case financial scenario for completing the Crossrail project. Yet this is against a backdrop that in December 2018, the Crossrail funding agreement committed the GLA to pick up any additional overspend. So what negotiations have been ongoing with the DFT, and how hopeful are you that they will contribute that to half, so at least probably 50 million, to finish funding Crossrail?
Well, I think what I would say is that a lot has happened since the end of 2018, and you know, it's clear right now that if during this financial year, you know, Crossrail requires more money, TfL are not in a position to provide it. Yeah. Now we have gone through 2 rounds of additional funding, which Luke, you know, has worked on and negotiated with the government, and you know, using extra business rate supplement, mayoral community infrastructure levy. The government have both lent money and made regulation changes to enable that to happen, to meet the government's requirement that all that additional spend by Crossrail as a jointly sponsored project, that we in London would ultimately pay for that, plus the finance costs, which in some cases, I think it's fair to say, are probably more than we could achieve, you know, higher than we would achieve elsewhere if we had a free hand. And so really where we are is going to be something that we have to pick up with DFT probably in the next round of funding negotiations, because it's probably at that point where Crossrail will be getting towards the end of their authority to spend the money that we've got. But it's just, you know, it's very clear it's a jointly sponsored project. The, you know, TfL clearly is taking emergency government funding and doesn't have the ability to do it. The Mayor has stepped in, as you see in the budget, and so it's really going to be, you know, a discussion with the government about how they can help get it across the line if that proves necessary.
No, I understand it's a jointly funded project, but obviously that was an extraordinary clause back in 2018 to have signed that, given what we now know, and hindsight's always that wonderful thing. But you've allocated 48.5 million. Where are you currently in terms of the overspend? I'm trying to remember from the Transport Committee, it's about 150, up to 150 million.
Yes, so I mean there are a range of different figures, whether you kind of take a very best case view, or whether you take, you'll be familiar, Assembly Member, with the phrases P50, P80 view. So it does iterate at the moment, and probably has increased. Some of those figures have increased slightly from when the numbers that the funding allocation was taken on. What the real focus is on, the Commissioner is laser-like focused on this, getting the project safely delivered as quickly and as cheaply as we can. And what he doesn't want to do, and he certainly doesn't want me to sit here and do, is give any impression that, you know, there's money available for this, and the costs of the remaining work don't matter, because they absolutely do. It's
I understand
very significant,
that,
and we don't have that knowledge about where it's coming from.
I understand that, and the sooner you open it, the sooner you have revenue coming in, and some of your costs go down because of the workforce. But I think when you were before us in January, and then Andy Byford before the Transport Committee in February, and then March, I think the figure is about 150 million. Where is it? What is the range at the moment in actual millions that you're out at the moment? I know you're trying to bring the cost down, and I get that drive. Goodness, we get that from the Commissioner. But where roughly are you at the moment?
Yeah, I don't think we're in a weird place where the figures have moved on from what you were previously told. So I think you can probably still rely on
the figures we had in January.
The Commissioner. I mean, obviously, they can things can move in either direction as things go on. My weekly Crossrail update actually dropped in my inbox just before this meeting, so I haven't had a chance to read it, and I'll be talking to Mark Wilde and team next week to get the latest. So we do, and obviously separately we have the Elizabeth Line Committee.
Of course, it's up to about 150 million. Is that correct? Just, I'm trying to test my memory here. Is it about that?
I mean, there are a number of different numbers, but certainly for some of them that could be right. So
okay, that's fine. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we're into other matters. Assembly Member Mayema.
Thank you. I'll be brief. I just wondered if you could please update us, David, on what are the impacts of the Kerslake review on the 22-23 budget and the delivery of affordable homes in that period.
Okay. So in terms of the Kerslake review, which of course was published last Friday, really that set out a few things. Firstly, the need for some more central GLA group coordination, and that will both need, senior professional leaders, has been talked about, a small team of staff to support them, and a project budget in order for them to address particular initiatives. And so that was established in the final group budget in anticipation of, we'd seen the draft of Lord Kerslake's review by then, and so we were in a position to put aside some money for that. What we've also been able to provide additional funding for now is in the GLA budget, GLA Mayor budget, which the Mayor signed on Wednesday, is for the Small Sites, Small Builders scheme, and which was one of the things that Lord Kerslake was very positive about and saw as an opportunity for potentially some of the smaller sites around the group. So those are things that you will see that are different in the budget as a consequence of Lord Kerslake's review. Beyond that, it's about clearly about increasing rates of delivery of affordable housing and de-risking some of the projects and plans that we have. And so, really as those plans are set out, hopefully it will give us all more confidence in their deliverability, because we'll have that extra working between teams and pooling specialisms and supporting each other, which should boost delivery.
Thank you. And the last quick one on this section for me. What is the budget assumption for pay awards for 2022-23 across the GLA group, and how are negotiations with Unison progressing?
So unless there are specific pay deals in place, the budget assumption was increased in the final draft group budget from 2% to 3%. Obviously, that then leads, is the envelope within which officers can negotiate. In some cases, clearly, negotiations are done at the national level. So, for instance, the Met has made its submission to the police pay review body, and we await that decision, which I think usually comes in July for implementation in September. In terms of the GLA, I believe the chief officer is engaged with Unison at the moment and is trying to bring the matter to conclusion, as quickly as possible, because we would, in an ideal world, given cost of living pressures and given that there wasn't a pay award for 21-22, given the government's position on public sector pay, clearly we would like to put that money into colleagues' pockets as quickly as we can.
Okay, thank you. And that brings that set of questioning to an end. So we're now moving on to the 22-23 budget funding for the London Assembly. My colleague, Assembly Member Bailey, will start these questions.
Thank you, Chair. I'll direct my first question to David, if I can. How confident are you that the London Assembly is sufficiently resourced to assess the increasingly complex £19 billion budget?
In some senses, I wish to be careful because it's not for me to scrutinise you or comment on your performance. As I understand it, you're on course for a budget underspend this year of around about £300,000, and the budget shows that your reserve position at year end is going to be around £1 million. So that suggests to me that you've got significant resources still available, and you're not coming up against sharp financial pressures.
Have you looked under the detail of why we're in that position?
I'm not sure that...
Sorry, David. I meant to say, I actually asked David, I did say David Gallie the question, but since David Bellamy has started answering, let's let him. Yeah. You continue, David, and then the other David can pile in, because you were halfway through, David. Don't let me stop you.
The Mayor's Chief of Staff thinks we've got too much money. Let's talk to David.
I'd like to understand why the Mayor's Chief of Staff believes we have too much money. Do you understand the detail? Have you been under the detail?
I'm not sure if the Assembly has restarted publishing its quarterly monitoring yet. I hope so. But as I say, I'm advised that that's the level of budget underspend you're going to have this year, and it's clear in the budget documents that there's a significant sum in reserves in excess of what may be needed in future for Assembly member resettlement. And so what that suggests to me is that you have significant resources. If the Assembly was the view that it didn't have the money to do what it needed to do, then I would expect colleagues from the Assembly to come and talk to me about that, and we could have a discussion.
The reason I challenge you with understanding the detail, because a large part of that underspend has actually been the Assembly's difficulties with recruiting, i.e. it will very quickly be reversed. This time next year we hope to be in a very different position, because as I pointed out early on, this £19 billion budget is increasingly complex, so we obviously need the staff to do that. That's why I challenge you to go back and look at the detail, because in my opinion it paints whoever's advised you has given you a very cursory look at what's going on. There's very particular reasons for that, and that's why I say what I say.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the point that the Assembly is very large, budget is very largely staffing, and therefore the underspend is because of vacancies. I do appreciate that, and so I'm not expecting that would be a recurring underspend, although the Assembly has often underspent. But that still means that at year end, as there's no proposal to kind of take that underspend back into corporate resources, that does increase the resources available to the Assembly for work.
Not functionally, because we can't spend that money elsewhere, can we?
It's that your money in your budget is going to, at year end, it's going to fall into your reserve. That's there's no proposal from the Mayor to take that money back off you, and so that will roll forward and be available to you in next or future years.
Yeah, but in revenue terms, we could do a capital spend of that money, but
no, it's all revenue funding.
Okay, fine. David Gallie, please answer the question. Would you like me to repeat the question for you?
No, just to reiterate, I think what you and David have both said. I mean, the reason for the underspend in the Assembly's budget this year is, as you say, is around the vacancies, and the expectation that Helen, you and you all have is that you will become fully staffed during the year, and that's why in your budget for next financial year there's at the moment an assumed vacancy factor that actually manages the situation you are anticipating, where by filling all your posts you'll actually be exceeding your budget and hence needing then to draw on the vacancy factor, but also drawing down on your reserves. And obviously there's further debate that Caroline, you mentioned at the Oversight Committee, that you'll also be having on finalising your budget in resolving those issues. And obviously I'm happy, as you feel appropriate, to help and advise on those issues.
Do you want to come
right,
in?
I'll come in here, because The HR department has been in an absolute shambles. For any of us to be able to employ anybody has been almost impossible. Not only has that department been a shambles, that we've been unable to get adverts out, been able to get people in, then of course people then started to know that we'd be moving here to the east of London, not into the central London. So quite a few people that we had in that wanted to come and work with us then didn't want to come because they didn't want to come to and work here at this venue. We are going through all sorts of problems recruiting staff. As you know, most of our budget is staffing, and the other departments are having issues in the same respect. And of course, this is all going to be made even more complex by the fact that we now have to take in or consider people that live in this specific area. I believe it was part of our planning permission before we can look at anybody else that's coming for work. So I'm quite het up about this because we have been trying to employ people for the last year to no success for very, very many issues, none of which were our fault. We have also mentioned you in private sessions about this money, Mr. Bellamy, and you have said that the Mayor kindly gave us a one-off grant last year. You also said earlier today that the money he get when you admitted to Assembly Member Fortune is actually, whilst it's taxpayers' money, it is given to him to use as he sees fit. Now, we're talking about 300k here. 300k, which actually is exactly the amount of increase that the Mayor's office budget has just had. So can you explain to me why all of our budget is down by 300k, which is what we want, and the Mayor's office budget has gone up by that amount?
Okay, so to just on your first point, like, I absolutely share your pain on some of the recruitment and related challenges we've had. I've had that pain too. I haven't had problem in terms of the relocation, in terms of attracting staff to want to work in the Mayor's office, but I have had very real other problems. I know we've discussed that privately with the Chief Officer, which is the right thing to do. In terms of the points about budget increases, we have in the one-off, both in the one-off spending that was available in this financial year coming to a close now, which came from government one-off council tax support. We treated the GLA Mayor budget and the GLA Assembly budget proportionately. And again, we've done the same in terms of recurring spend between the GLA Mayor budget and the GLA Assembly budget. And then obviously within those budgets, there's a decision about how to allocate the additional resource, which in the Mayor's budget, you know, there are a number of directorates in which a choice has to be made. And we've obviously, earlier in this municipal year, talked about the Mayor's office and the restructure and why we needed to do the changes that we made there.
Okay. At the very beginning of this session, Mr. Gallie, I asked why we had yet another massive windfall, if you like, at the end, which is not the money that we did all our scrutiny on, an extra 556 million. You then pointed out to all of us that actually that was only 0.3, and then you quite correctly corrected it to a mere 3% of his budget. So 556 million is a mere percentage of the budget. We're looking at £300,000 just in order to scrutinise you all properly. That's all, 300,000. So if you think that 556 million pounds is a drop in the ocean, why are we having to ask you just to top up the budget so that we can keep staff in place in order to scrutinise the 19+ billion pound budget that you award hundreds of millions of pounds all over the place to? Can you explain that and explain why the Mayor's budget has gone up by 300,000, which I suppose is not a lot at all, Mr. Gallie, if you think 556 million isn't much?
Just on what I was trying to do was set out the mathematics of 556 over 19 billion, which is 3%. So, you know, that remains a mathematically factual statement. I mean...
And well, what's 300,000 then? You work that out? What sort of a percentage is that?
I can't, on the top of my head, I can't do that.
No, but it's not much, is it? While you're looking at billions, this is not much, and yet
it's 3.75% of your budget, Chair.
Chair.
Right, would you like to answer that? Can you explain why the Mayor gets 300k and we lose it?
Well, as set out in the Mayor's final budget that was signed and published recently this week, the details are set out as to why the Mayor's budget has gone up, and that reflects the restructure of the Mayor's office that we have talked about before. It also reflects the changes that have occurred around the treatment of the Mayor's travel expenses as well. So that's all documented in that particular paper. And obviously the allocation of those resources, you know, reflects that restructure which the Oversight Committee was consulted upon.
Well, I think quite honestly, some of these answers are nothing short of pathetic. We do not cost very much money scrutinising you. With a £19 billion budget, £19 billion of taxpayers' money has got to be scrutinised. When we're looking at hundreds of millions going in all directions, all to different projects, we have got to be very careful with our budgets because they're mainly staffing, and it's staffing in order to scrutinise you. Do you think, as Chief of Staff, Mr Bellamy, it's a good look that the Mayor removes money from the body that scrutinise him, and yet his budget goes up and up and up?
He didn't remove money. One-off funding came to an end. If we're going to get accurate,
it was his choice. That was his choice, Chair, to give us money in one-off funding.
If allocations of one-off funding lead to complaints, the logical thing to do is not to give any one-off funding before. As I understood it, the Assembly was grateful to have received that money a year ago, given the difficult budget situation we all found ourselves in. If that's not the case, then please do advise me.
Well, I don't see that we should be grateful for scraps thrown to us to keep us going in order to scrutinise you. You didn't answer my question. Do you think it's a good look that we have to come begging for money to keep the Assembly going, the board that actually scrutinises all of you and the Mayor? Do you think it's a good look?
Chair, I've been doing this job coming up 6 years now. The Assembly has never once come to me begging for money, and the Assembly has never once come to me and said, David, we've been doing some work, we're trying to think strategically about how we as an Assembly can be more effective, do a better job, provide better value for money for Londoners through that, and based on this proposal, this is what we think will be needed financially to do it. If you want to do that, and I've said this before, I'm genuinely open to the conversation, but you've not wanted to do that.
David, in private meetings, we have asked about this budget. I've seen Assembly Member Bailey, and then I've seen Assembly Member Pigeon.
Sorry, Chair, I didn't understand it. I thought you were just going to come in and make a comment. I've got a question I want to ask. What do you think of the inherent difficulties are in the process in which the Mayor effectively sets the budget for the Assembly like he does for any other functional body? Do you think it's a problem that the Mayor gets to pick the level of resource we have to then scrutinise his work?
So the Mayor gets to set propose the budget and for the Assembly, and then the Parliament has laid out the process by which and the limitations on that process by which the Assembly is allowed to change it. And then you have the power within that allocation to determine how that money is spent. That is the statutory position. I don't see that statutory position changing any time soon.
Sorry, David.
So the best thing to do is to, and as I say, if we go back 18 months ago, I spent in my summer in a long and painful exchange of letters, which was an argument, or as I said, repeating those letters, I'm very happy to sit down and have a strategic discussion along the lines we just talked about to the Chair's question. I'm very happy to do that. And that's how we should work within the statutory framework, which is what it is.
But the question I asked you was, do you think that there's a problem there? Do you think what's the inherent difficulty there? Do you think there's a problem?
I think, yeah, what the legislation provides is that the Mayor is ultimately responsible for the financial resources of this authority. And that is the statutory position. And given that accountability that he has to Londoners, his decision-making in terms of what he proposes in allocations for the Assembly, for the GLA Mayor budget, for the functional bodies, he's accountable to Londoners for. That's how it works.
What advice is traditionally given to the Mayor on the impact of the funding decision he makes for the Assembly? We've sat here this morning and spoke about the deep problems we've had looking at things like MOPAC. They simply don't provide information. It takes us much more time, much more officer time than it should do because they don't have it, can't provide it. You know, we've talked about the complexity of the budget. We've seen that the Mayor's budget's grown. If his budget's grown, something must be changing here. So why are we not being supported in the way that we need to be supported in order to provide decent scrutiny?
So 2 points. Firstly, while it's right the GLA Mayor budget has grown, if you look at the group budget documents, you'll see that the overall group budget is falling by about £700 million next year. So in fact, in a macro sense, we're shrinking. And the Assembly budget is going up despite that. What the Mayor receives in advice actually comes from the Oversight Committee, who talk about their budget and submit an informal proposal to the Mayor, which the Mayor then considers in making his proposal for consultation on what the Assembly budget should be. And so the primary source of advice the Mayor has about the Assembly budget comes from the Assembly Oversight Committee, which of course will be making its proposals considering the budget guidance that the Mayor sets out for the group.
Just one last question, small piece of clarification. You say in a macro sense where we're contracting. Is the Mayor's budget contracting?
So the GLA group budget is the Mayor's budget, and that is contracting.
No, that the Mayor spends on his activities.
Well, if money is spent throughout the GLA group, like that is, with the possible exception of the Assembly, that is the Mayor's activity to which he's accountable to Londoners.
Okay. Chair.
Assembly Member Pigeon.
If I've calculated it right, this 300,000 we're arguing about is 0.0005%. So it is a drop in the ocean. And you've been here 6 years, I've been here 14 years. I used to not have grey hairs before I came here.
Tell me about it.
And the previous Mayor did not touch the Assembly's budget. He understood that there was a real conflict in cutting the body that is set up in law to scrutinise you and your budgets. The Assembly did offer up efficiencies, and we made sure that we were playing our part, but he did not once come for our budget. So what I would ask is, and I welcome what you've said today, you have said that if we come to you with, we think we need this money to be able to fund this scrutiny structure so we can really properly scrutinise the Mayor, his budgets and all the other aspects that have grown, certainly since I have been here, that you will look at that positively and put that growth bid to the Mayor. Is that what you're saying today? Because if that's the case, then after this, as Chair of Oversight, I will be talking to officers to make sure we start working up those plans, because that would help us to do our job and hopefully make your job easier, because we have got the right figures, the right analysis to ask you the questions, so we are holding the Mayor to account.
So deal with the 2 points there. Firstly, I can't talk about the negotiations that went on under the previous Mayor or how things were done, because I wasn't here. I can just do with the facts that I've got in front of me, which are that the Assembly's net budget in 2010-11 was £8.6 million. By 2016-17, the last budget set with the previous Mayor, that had reduced to £7.2 million. Then under this Mayor's budget setting, the Assembly budget went up in 2021, which was the last budget pre-pandemic, to 8.6 million, and now it's at 8.0 million. So on the reading of the facts, I don't think anybody can say that the decisions of the Mayor have been detrimental to the Assembly compared to what has gone on in the past. I'll say again, I'm absolutely up for a private sit-down strategic discussion about how we make this authority better. The Chair pointed out some issues in HR. We've touched on those privately. I want to see this authority be as effective as possible. That includes the Assembly. It's in nobody's interest, to be frank, and you pointed this out in correspondence, when this committee publishes reports that has so many factual errors in it, as your budget report did. And I do believe that effective scrutiny is beneficial to all of us. And so, yeah, I'm absolutely up for that discussion. All of it comes, we haven't touched this morning on the overall financial position we're likely to find ourselves in and the uncertainty around that, which probably tempers all of our ambitions in different ways. But I'm very up for that sort of strategic discussion.
Well, I would like to have a discussion, particularly when we are talking about the sort of numbers we're talking are so small. And yes, as I say, we offered up some efficiency savings under the previous Mayor. He didn't come proactively to us, but also we slimmed down Travel Watch, London Travel Watch, which also comes out of our budget. And London Travel Watch is being increasingly efficient and good as an organisation. We want to do more. So if you welcome that, I'm going to take that and we will look to put together, because there's clearly growth needed in certain areas of our scrutiny body work. And our scrutiny staff in order to carry out our job, and it's becoming harder and harder with the resources we've got. So I look forward to that discussion in private.
Yeah, and say I would see that there are probably gaps in your scrutiny. I think there are also some historic ways in which the Assembly organises itself that may not be as effective and potentially in some cases as efficient as they could be. And so I absolutely think there are things we could talk about.
Good, and we certainly shall. Assembly Member Fortune.
Thank you very much, Chair. I was listening very closely to what David said there, and I agree. David B, not David G. It's like a pop band, like the Spice Boys. So I was listening to David G about the one-off fund, and I agree with you. And I might get in trouble here, but I agree. You're absolutely right. That one-off funding to overcome a particular problem, once that's removed, that's not a cut. And I think, I'm really pleased to see that way of thinking, because any other one-off funding that's applied to overcome a particular situation, sort of uplifting COVID payments or anything like that, something that's one-off for a temporary period of time to deal directly with something, when that's removed, that's not a cut. I agree with you, and I look forward to that thinking of being applied elsewhere. Another thing I should just pick up is it was suggested that the figures in the London Assembly, or the response, the committee's budget response, were wrong. I don't think that's right. I think they were disputed. And there's a subtle difference with that, because it's not surprising that the Mayor's office would dispute figures that we would put forward, is my understanding of that.
Just on that last point, that what was passed back as corrections there, none of that came from the Mayor's office. That came from the professional finance officers around the GLA group. Okay. Whose judgment I trust.
So because of some of those disputed, those figures, or figures were challenged, whatever, that leads to the question I was going to ask, which was around the response, because the Mayor's response to the committee's budget report this year was after the final budget had been considered by the London Assembly. And I think what we're talking about here in that exchange about those figures and the conversation about those figures were some of the reason for that delay. Is that right?
It didn't help.
Yeah.
I'll be honest. The primary reason that came out as late as it did was pressure of work on me and not having the chance to go through it all. Okay.
So what commitment can we have next year that we can get a more timely response? How can we do that better?
It's a good question. We've always tried get it back. I mean, there have been occasions where I literally remember the Mayor signing the letter on the morning of the meeting because we couldn't get it to him any sooner. We really try to. It's one of the challenging things about the budget process is that it take, like the committee rightly, and I don't disagree at all, points out the challenges for it from the statutory process that we have to operate within. I would say those challenges are even worse for us because we've got to write the budget and then, properly prepare as we should do for your scrutiny. And that is, is exceptionally pressured work. We have, the budget documents have grown and grown over time as we've tried to be more and more transparent and set out what's going on. And that creates more and more work in terms of writing them and reviewing them and ensuring that they're accurate. And, like I say, we're very stuck on the dates we have in the budget process, but we possibly have some more opportunity within that on some of the material. And I think, we should possibly have a little bit of think about, well, firstly, what by law do we need to set out? Secondly, what is useful to the Assembly, to the public, to, us for the next year? And where are the documents sometimes going into detail that isn't necessary, or they're setting things out that are just subject to change, and so actually why not just say, we'll come back to that, and just try and make the administrative side of the process quicker, which then will get us to dealing with your report sooner. And
I get that. So, we've got an increasingly complex mayoral budget with a 20% growth this year, tight time frames, about 4% reduction in the London Assembly budget this year, restricting that ability. So I think it's really welcoming that we're going to have a conversation to improve that process for next year. So I look forward to seeing what happens there.
Just a stat, and then the total, So in the first GLA group budget, which was set by ministers, was £2.2 billion. This year's budget on the revenue side, kind of like we like, was 14.9. So and I think we acknowledged this when the previous executive director resources retired. The huge change that there had been over
and I think members are reflecting that completely. So that complexity of that budget needs to be matched by a complexity of the budget and the abilities of the Assembly to scrutinise. That's the that's the yin and yang as we all strive to do the best for Londoners. So we're tight of time. So thank you.
Right. Okay. I look forward to that conversation, David. And I look forward to it being fruitful. Okay, we're now moving on to the impact of the 25th of February financial support agreement for TfL. Assembly Member Pidgeon is kicking this off.
Yes, I am. Thank you. Okay, so this is the TfL agreement. So what is the impact of the latest agreement for TfL on your final budget?
So what the deal does, obviously, is provide government support until the 24th of June. And what then that has enabled TfL to do at its board meeting on Wednesday is set a budget for the financial year. But what it is doing, though, is setting that budget with very real uncertainty, because it is making an assumption about, government funding continuing. Now, the government...
So beyond June, you mean?
Beyond June, yes. So the government have provided comfort that they will continue to fund this year, but comfort and certainty are not the same things, and obviously you don't quite know about quantum or if the government may try and bring in conditions in any subsequent funding deal. And so what that really means is a very large amount of uncertainty for us as we TfL as basically a £10 billion organisation, rather than doing the kind of 5-year business planning to drive the budget that we should do, the TfL finance team know that it's highly likely that they're having to ask the board to produce an updated budget in July, and even then they can't be certain that that will be the last one of the year, and that's really, it's no way to run an organisation of that size, but that's the reality of where we are.
Yes, it's very uncertain. So what has TfL assumed? I haven't gone through the board papers yet from Wednesday. We've had a full-on week here. What is the assumption from June in the papers for funding from the government?
So from memory, from memory, nothing has changed there in terms of it's a pro rata of the, I think 1.2 billion TfL was needing for the year. And then the government funding is for the first 3 of the 13 periods. And then the balance comes from, is assumed to come in subsequent funding deal or deals.
Okay. Okay, so that's been prorated, so we can get that detail from that paper then. The current funding agreement, we hear a lot about conditions from government, and I understand all that from public and private discussions. But does the current funding agreement actually include any proposals that the Mayor has put in?
So I'm not quite sure what you're looking for there. The way the funding process works in outline is that obviously DfT receive a range of monitoring information from TfL. They have periodic meetings to go through that and other information, and then the government come forward with their proposal, and TfL either say, well, right, okay, we can see a way to make that work, however that clause is not written very well, or etc. Or TfL say, I'm sorry, you've misunderstood something, and that, that isn't going to be workable. And so, we very much can input into that process, but it's the government who do that. Clearly, the Mayor has written to the Transport Secretary on a number of occasions, setting out our position and thoughts on the way forward, and then the government takes a decision about whether or not it wishes to take that on board. For instance,
really, the reality...
vehicle excise, devolution of vehicle excise duty has been one thing the Mayor has consistently made the case for, and the government has equally consistently refused to grant.
So it's more a case that it's fine-tuning the language of the final agreement is kind of TfL mayoral input in some ways, more than what is actually in it.
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say that there are discussions, and the Commissioner and the Permanent Secretary speak periodically. And what we really want to do is, coming back to my earlier answer, is get longer term strategic funding as part of saying, right, how can we make TfL financially sustainable? Because it's clear the 2015 spending review, which made TfL so dependent on fair income, was we were concerned about a recession coming along. Yeah, like actually we got COVID, and in some ways, just looked at it purely from TfL finance, it's clear that was far worse than the recession. But in other ways, it forced everybody to face up to the fact there was an issue and a problem. And we've wanted, and it's why, for instance, TfL commissioned their independent review, and from that set out their financial sustainability plan, because what we absolutely want is TfL's long-term financial sustainability. What we're in a place is the government is much more focused on short-term thinking. What I really hope is that there will be proper long-term discussions leading up to the next funding deal that actually help us get that long-term financial sustainability, which everybody says they want to see.
Okay, thank you.
Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you, Chair. So yes, sort of following on the funding deal, and in particular looking at healthy streets. So I understand that there's an extra 50 million has been allocated to healthy streets schemes. Just to be clear, is that on top of the 39 million that was originally allocated to healthy streets? So we're looking at 89 million for healthy streets for this year.
We'll have to take that offline and come back to you so I'll give you an accurate answer. It's obviously complicated because there were some things in TfL's budgets already that were about healthy streets, but TfL's budget assumes government funding in order that it's budget balanced. Yeah, and so, you know, if while the government would probably like to say, okay, right, here's some money for active travel, and it's very much additional. At the same time, the government, you know, wasn't really giving extra money on top of what was needed for the TfL sums to add up. So it's a little, you know,
so
yes,
it might not be 89 million.
There is some additional stuff, but it's also the interplay between the fact that we've only got a funding deal for 3 periods, and yet investment in schemes and, you know, investment in borough staff and things like that needs to, you know, you're not going. If you say, right, let's go and build that bit of cycle route there, it's going to take more than 3 periods to do that, and so it gets complicated. I don't want to mislead you, so I'd rather we try and write and set it out clearly.
Now, obviously, even if it is in total 89 million, that's a drop in the ocean compared to what we were expecting in 2019-20, when we were expecting to have 414 million for healthy streets in this financial year. So it would be very good to have absolute clarity about whether that extra 50 million takes the total amount that we're looking at for healthy streets up to 89 million for this year. So if you could come back to us with clarity on that, because otherwise we can't keep track of what that spending is being used for. Now, the allocations from this pot of money for healthy streets, that we don't know exactly what the size of it is for the year, will Transport for London be making public the allocations that are agreed for projects? And presumably this is borough funding as well. So what's the timetable and process for making public what that money is being spent on?
Yes, so I think that's ongoing at the moment, and, you know, I absolutely would expect that it would be made public, either in announcements on any specific schemes or otherwise.
I mean, Caroline, if it might come in, I understand there's actually a letter that's going out to boroughs shortly from TfL that sets out some further information on this, so I think that will be in the public domain shortly.
Okay, so we can expect there to be information in the public domain shortly. Is that affected by the pre-election period?
I understand the letters are sort of on their way or imminent. I think they're very keen to ensure it could go out before the pre-election period. But again, perhaps I can explore that with you as soon as we can.
Okay, because we need to be able to track and understand exactly what's happening there. Now, I understand that there's an active travel oversight group which is run between Number 10, the Department for Transport, and Transport for London, that is involved in setting the investment for healthy streets. I have 2 questions. One is this level of oversight on such a small budget normal, and what sight are we able to have of the decision making that goes on within that oversight group?
Yeah. Okay. So, firstly, clearly, the existence of that group is not normal. It's a condition of the funding agreements, and it didn't exist before those funding agreements were in place. It is, to be clear, it is oversight, and it is about ensuring that there is a forum for discussion between the government, who are, after all, are providing the money, and Transport for London about how that money is being used. And I would imagine some of the challenges from the lack of money compared to, as you say, what we would like to do. But to be very clear, the decision-making power for that money sits with Transport for London, because it is money. Obviously, where the funding agreement says it has to be spent on stuff on this area, then it has to be spent on that area, because that's a funding commitment. But it is Transport for London is the decision-making body. Okay,
and do you know if that group has had any focus on Vision Zero as a principle for the spending of this Healthy Streets money?
I'm not cited on like minutes or discussions that go on there, so it's probably best I don't speculate.
Because I think, I'm interested, as someone who scrutinises what the Healthy Streets money gets spent on, in whether the government supports the principle of Vision Zero and whether it would commit to including it as a supported goal of the long-term funding deal. Is that something that you're able to come back to us on?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, we can provide more information. I mean, I think this discussion is one I'm most happy to try, is getting to a point where it's it's a discussion you want to have with the Walking and Cycling Commissioner, to be honest, rather than me.
Fair enough. So, question for David Gallie. What is the current status of talks about a longer-term settlement at the end of the latest deal in June 22?
I think David might be better placed than myself, being closer, I think, to those negotiations.
Yeah. So, at the moment, the focus is, as colleagues will know, will be making the case to government that TfL requires additional capital funding, and it needs that on a sustainable multi-year basis. The government has said in the funding deal that it will consider that. We're at the moment awaiting a proposal from the government on that, and then clearly we'll be discussing that proposal with them. So that's the first thing that's going on. I don't believe, with the focus there, I don't think there's been any discussion about the next funding deal when the current one runs out in June. Obviously, we would want that to be a long-term deal that would take us through the financial year, and then we've got that certainty, and that sets us on a clear path so that we know what we've got to do from 23-24 when that support ends. But ultimately, we're in the hands of the government who will decide how they want to play that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Which of the conditions in the 25th of February funding agreement are the most challenging? And I'll give you the whole question actually all in one go. And how will these be addressed by TfL, and what will the impact be?
I mean, I don't have a list of the conditions in front of me in order to kind of quickly score them and say which I think. I think things that are particularly challenging, clearly, the lack of funding certainty, that has made it very difficult for TfL, and we've seen this, to commission renewals work because they don't know that they're going to have the ability to spend it, and to commission projects because they don't know that they'll have the run rate of money to deliver them. So that and the general financial tightness is clearly a key thing. I think the other thing I would say is it's not so much necessarily about individual conditions, it's about the cumulative effect and the amount of work that TfL management team have to spend ensuring that they meet these conditions, and that is time that could otherwise have been spent on other things. And I think that's a burden that the TfL executive team certainly feel.
Yeah, certainly as an outside observer, seeing this kind of drip of agreements lasting for very short periods of time, it seems an incredibly inefficient way of providing support to a city. And it would be great if they would come forward with something with a bit more longevity to it, so that some proper, decent planning can go ahead. Are you worried about any risks from the short-term nature of the funding? I mean, obviously, there's all there's the risk that TfL just goes under financially, but are there any particular risks that come from the short-term nature of the funding?
I mean, as I say, it just becomes very hard for TfL to deliver schemes because they don't know. Like TfL doesn't really do things that just can be done in a couple of months. TfL makes major long-term investments. Either cycle routes take very many months to design and get consent and then physically deliver, and similarly on maintenance stuff. And I am I am concerned that increasingly there is maintenance work and renewal work that should have happened and hasn't happened, and things will go wrong and assets will have to be taken out of use as a consequence of that. While in one sense, the managed decline stuff begins next April, in many ways it's happening now, and you don't see it till you see it, but when you do, you really won't like it.
Yeah. No, indeed, and maintenance is not very glamorous, but it's absolutely essential. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. We're coming to the last section now, which is the Mayor's Capital Spending Plan 22-23. Assembly Member Fortune is going to start.
Thank you very much. This is a question about MOPAC's capital plans to David B. The plans include 170 million capital spend on transforming the estate. What can we expect to see as a result?
You're probably, I think, bringing together a few different things there. So there's an ongoing property services works program, obviously, in just trying to improve the condition of buildings. There are major refurbishments of a number of Met buildings, for instance, in Limehouse, Kentish Town, Kensington. There's a budget in there for acquisitions of property where that is needed as well. We additionally have an allocation in terms of the Central Estates Programme, which deals with, obviously there are limits to what I can say, but colleagues will be aware about the agreement between the Mayor and the Government to bring all the counter-terrorism command and associated partner support together in one building. And there's both the spend on the works associated with that, but also knock-on works in terms of, for instance, where the Met's organised crime function will be accommodated as it moves out of that building. So there's that spend, and there are other items about just ongoing improvements to buildings, many of which are just not really had investment for 20 years and desperately need it.
Thank you. And I know colleagues have asked in other places about bringing some of the blue light services together. Is there any update on how that will be? That co-working will be improved with this capital investment?
Yeah. So there are a couple of pilots going on at the moment. One that I've mentioned before to the committee in terms of Met officers co-located at the fire station in Purley. We also have a project in Barnet where the ambulance service are co-located with the fire brigade there, and certainly that last one is got to go through decision making in both organisations, but I'm very much expecting that to be built on. There are other areas going on at the moment that are not quite ready to talk about publicly, where potentially Met Police could use some of GLA group office space, and so there are a range of things that are being worked on at the moment.
You raised decision making there. Of course, something that I guess is a bit of a challenge is not having a Met Commissioner. Is that going to slow any of this decision making down?
So we do have a Met Police Commissioner.
Well, but you know what I mean. There's a new Met Commissioner coming in.
Yeah.
And try that one, David B.
Yeah. So I think the course in terms of what we're talking about, in terms of the Met's capital programme, in terms of estates, but also in terms of digital, is well set. Obviously, of course, the estate stuff, ultimately they're MOPAC assets, not Met Police assets, and so the kind of there's a unified view on the way forward there. So I'm not seeing that that's going to cause any issues at all.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one question in a minute, but David Bellamy, I've been going on about blue light collaboration for years. It is absolutely a way we can save money, and I'm sure you know that. We've just got to get these different services together to see how we can and to bring it forward as quickly as we can, because it would definitely save a great deal of money.
I totally agree. It's probably not always as easy, or
I know.
gets the savings, and part of the problem often can be that much of the blue light estate is not in a great state, which makes it then challenging to bring more colleagues in. But we're as one on this, Chair.
Yeah, I know. I just wish it would happen earlier or quicker, which I'm sure you do. So to David Gallie, given the underspend for 21-22, how achievable are MOPAC's capital spending plans for 22-23? And are there any risks to delivering MOPAC's 22-23 capital programme? David Gallie.
Yeah, I'm asking Enver, I think, who might be able to respond on that one. The work that he does with MOPAC's capital.
Right, it's good to hear from you, Enver.
Thanks for the difficult question. There are risks with capital across the group going forward, because there are going to be supply issues, inflationary issues, construction issues across the group, and I don't believe that MOPAC is any exception to that. They've got quite an ambitious programme. And it has historically slipped from one year to the next. So,
well, it has. Hence the question.
Yeah. So they still believe that there are challenges to that. They're saying that there's challenges to getting planning permission on certain buildings. There is supply chain blockages, and there's inflation that's rising. So with all those conditions, there is still a risk, and all we can do at this stage is to work closely with them.
Okay, so if they're already flagging it, Enver, to what extent are they flagging that there's going to be an issue?
Only to the extent that all of the rest of the group is raising, as these are common issues on capital that we're having to tackle for the coming year. And, we have to basically work with them through the year. No one's at the moment saying that they're coming up with an underspend. They're just flagging what issues we need to be aware of.
I think, Chair, it's an issue about risks. There are very significant risks to all capital delivery projects at the moment because of inflation issues and supply chain issues and labour market issues. And all of these can combine and create a very challenging environment for delivery. Those factors will undoubtedly play out in different ways in different projects, including the governance and oversight that each organisation has around its capital programme is there to do their best to get ahead of those and mitigate them. So the budget has been set on what every organisation believes is a realistic basis, and then we'll see how those risks transpire and how they can be mitigated as we go through the year.
Okay, I hear what you say, but we ask about MOPAC for a specific reason. Assembly Member Pigeon.
Yeah. The issue I have with this is we've got 170 million capital to transform the Met's estate, yet we have not yet seen the estate strategy to work out what the money's being spent on, whether it's good value for money, whether it's being spent on a estate that you're going to sell in a few years, or a lease would be returned, or so on. We haven't got any of that detail. So when can we expect the estate strategy to be published so we can put these two together, so we can make sure that this capital spend is value for money?
Can I just come in while we're waiting for that?
Go on, if you want to.
So I think it was, from what we understood, it was almost nearly ready, and then the Kerslake report's come out. So what they've said to us is that they want to update it for any implications of the Kerslake report, and at that point, it should be.
So they are doing that. I'm just looking to see if I got a more concrete thing on date, and I can't seem to find the magic page. It's probably actually less a concern for me, the Kerslake report, than, which I think doesn't impact the draft strategy, which I saw very much. It's more being clear about net zero and the work that's going on there. And what I would say is that clearly a lot of the budget that has been set around the Met Estates programme is around continuation of big multi-year schemes like the Counter-Terror Centre, which is probably about a 5-year project. And so that's already in there. And the estate strategy isn't going to do any kind of big U-turns on things like that. And the reality is that there are clearly a significant number of police buildings that are both, it's a no-brainer that the Met are going to retain that building and that work has to be done on it. And so it's not, it's not a problem. The strategy clearly is trying to forward look over a number of years in terms of future decisions that will be made about individual buildings. But there's a lot of decisions that already have been made that this budget reflects.
I think it just helps us in trying to assure ourselves in doing our job if we could see both and see how it all fitted together. And at the moment, we've just been blind and we've been asking for this estate strategy. I mean, it's years now almost. So that would be helpful. And I had received more information on some of these projects from the finance team because I went back and asked. But I think that would be really helpful. And if you have got a revised date for publication, it would be useful to receive that. Thank you.
I think we've got the answer. It's all on a magic page, and as if by magic, it keeps disappearing. Perhaps one day we'll know the answer to that. So, last questioning is coming from Assembly Member Hirani.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, to David Gallie. So, just looking at the TfL capital spending budget, on the working capital and reserves line for 21-22, it's showing in the green for in the region of 483.5 million, and then the year after in the red for 345.9 million. That's a fluctuation of about 829.4 million. So what's driving the fluctuation?
Yeah, I mean, it's largely, as I understand it, a balancing item in TfL's capital programme. So we can perhaps supply more detail about what's been driving that. But it becomes, rather than as a clear explanation that I have to hand, we can perhaps write to you more formally around with the detail from TfL.
Yeah, if you could, and to the Chair as well. And looking at the revenue contributions, are they realistic given TfL's financial difficulties?
Well, it obviously depending on the earlier conversations that we've had with them, as Dave has explained the questions. I mean, TfL's position remains, precarious if further funding does not become available. I mean, the revenue contributions themselves are likely, I think, to come from the GLA's business rates. You recall the GLA's business rates, the TfL has a capital element and a revenue element. And the way TfL classifies that is actually the business rates from the GLA for capital. So in terms of the GLA's allocation is solid, but I think TfL's programme remains very much in the lap of the gods here.
And in terms of, so just on that particular budget line, is the most important factor on that maybe people actually tapping the Royster, going through the ticket lines? What's driving the reason for needing that revenue contribution?
No, the revenue contributions line is from the business rates that the GLA allocates to TfL for supporting its capital programme. It's been treated as a revenue contribution. Okay. So it isn't dependent on fares income.
Okay. Is that wise to have that as a sort of source for that budget line?
I mean, again, it goes back to accounting classifications here. The way that capital programmes are normally constructed is going through capital grants, capital receipts, revenue contributions. It's a sort of standard way of that classification. I guess in this instance, it doesn't really get to the nub of what you've been asking.
Yeah. Okay, I think we'll leave it there in the interest of time. And the final question is to David Bellamy. Just looking at the Mayor's capital spending plan, it doesn't include figures for the OPDC. So looking at the budget lines, it seems to finish at LLDC. What level of capital expenditure would you anticipate if the required level of funding and the land transfers with the public sector bodies could be secured?
I mean, that's essentially as set out in the strategic outline business case, which we've submitted to the Secretaries of State, as you would know. And yeah, I don't think it's yet in the public domain, but we'd be very happy if it was, and so we'll publish that as soon as the government's comfortable for us to do so.
So have you allocated, or do you have any capital spending set aside in case it was to be brought forward for next year?
No, we don't. We do have a Mayoral Development Corporation reserve, which provides some revenue funding available as a contingency for both LLDC and OPDC, which obviously is available for claims. But you know, that clearly, I forget how much is in there at the moment. But David might just be able to turn to the right page while I talk. But it's clearly not of the quantum that would be needed for the business case that we've submitted to government.
So what David Gallie search is...
It's possibly worth adding, though, the Mayor's shown his commitment to OPDC on top of the annual revenue funding through approving a significant allocation from the Land Fund, which will help OPDC kickstart its work there, and of course support from the affordable housing programme as well for affordable housing in the area.
So what I'm trying to get a sense of is that you're confident that if capital funding was required for 22-23, that you would have the sources and the pots to able to finance that.
So I mean the plan for 22-23 absolutely involves the Land Fund, which we've, as you say, is a decision that's been made, and then it's a case of the discussions with the government in terms of setting things out in years beyond that. Bearing in mind that not all, but a lot of investment can only really start happening once HS2 construction ends and those sites become available to build on.
And just to answer your question, the MDC reserve now stands at about 20 million. Clearly that's nothing like the scale of investment that potentially OPDC will need in terms of taking forward the project, and clearly we need to return to that issue in terms of how OPDC's plans can be financed and the GLA's level of contribution that may be necessary or is available.
Okay, thank you. I know this is really remiss of me. I know the planning was going to be heard in January. Has it gone through and have they been given planning permission?
So not planning permission, the local plan.
The local plan, that's it.
So the inspector had the public sessions in January, and we had hoped that he was then going to be able to issue his report by now. Understand he's still backwards and forwards getting his clearance within the planning inspectorate, which is taking longer than we thought. So we're just waiting for that process to conclude before OPDC can adopt the plan.
Because they were quite convinced it'd be through by now, but we'll chase up on that.
Yeah,
thank
that
you.
internal process has taken longer than
Much longer. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Well, that's it for today. Thank you, and I would like to thank our guests for attending this morning and for their answers to our questions. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion?
Noted.
Thank you. Can we also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting?
Agreed.
Thank you. There's just a little question on this. First of all, can I ask the committee to note the quarterly monitoring reports?
Noted.
Thank you. Now, payments over £250, so that is in pages 159 to 196. One of the items for the Q3 appears to be 2.7 million of property management fees going to Avison Young. Can you explain what properties this would relate to?
I can't directly, obviously I'm happy to write to you, Chairman.
Well, I'd like a full list, please, because there seems to be major fluctuations in the fees paid to this firm over previous quarters. In Q2, the fees were around 25 to 30k, but in Q1 they were around 2 million. So I'm assuming there's a natural explanation for this. But
I haven't got that to hand, but obviously I'll write to you, Chairman.
Okay, it's a lot of money, or not, according to you, Mr. Gallie. Not a lot of money at all. Okay, thank you for that. If you could do that as a matter of urgency, because I want to know what that is, please. Can I ask the committee to note that report, subject to us getting answers? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the Mayor's decision list for the period 5th of November 2021 to 10th of March 2022 and decide whether to highlight any issue for detailed consideration? Okay, thank you. Next meeting of the committee will be agreed by the London Assembly at its annual meeting in May 2022. I have no other urgent business today, so that concludes today's meeting.